It is now my pleasure to call on Ambassador Kenneth Taylor, who will deliver the commencement address.
Well, President Levesque, President-elect, family, faculty, and to the most important group of people in New York State today, the graduates of 2013. I'm myself delighted to be at the podium with Bill, with John, remarkable accomplishments, and I assume that about 3 o'clock this morning, all of us will envisage ourselves as Bill leading this flock of whether it be goose, cranes, or what have you across the gorge. And what a great time to be a Canadian in New York State. And that comes as no surprise, because here you have a group of accomplished men and women, another milestone in their life, and I've looked at the program, and it is a story of achievement. And then, of course, I do want to assure you that although there are a number of Canadians here today, and a number of us on the podium, that we do have not any imperialistic designs. You may have seen our massing our customs officer across the bridge, but that had no intent. From my own point of view, and I think you'll find those, particularly those of you who are in education, that the young men and women you talk to are looking beyond the border. And maybe that's because I attempted to practice diplomacy, but I liked the way it was articulated by a Polish newspaper journalist. He published widely. His name was Ryszard Kupaczynski. He graduated in 1955, and in Warsaw, the newspaper he worked at, he said to his editor, "I want to go abroad." She said, "But why?" A bit startled, because in Warsaw in 1955, you didn't make up your mind and go abroad. But he said, "I'm not interested in going to London, Paris, Rome. I just want to go to Czechoslovakia." It's not the end, it's not the destination that matters. It's just this transcendent feeling that you cross the border. And I think that reflects the state of both countries and our neighbors as well today, that we're simply put interconnected. No matter what you do today, no matter what somebody does in India, it all has implications for all of us. And that is something that really is a development of the last, say, 10 or 15, 20 years. My first assignment as a diplomat was Guatemala. We had two Canadians in Guatemala and Central America covering the region. That's been generous to our efforts. How to get to Guatemala, I thought. I was in Ottawa, and the Foreign Service management then was somewhat more laconic than it is now. There weren't many MBAs around. I said, "I'm getting married." Pat, my wife, was graduating at University of California in Berkeley. I had 3 weeks vacation, and I saw an advertisement in New York Magazine, "Take a slow boat down the Pacific." I said, "What a good idea." So I went to see the director of rotations and said, "I'd like to take this boat down to Guatemala." He said, "Well, as long as you get there by October 25th. I said, "Oh, that's fine. We'll get married October 1. The trouble was that Grace Lines didn't agree with my personal schedule. Come November 15th, I got a telegram from Ottawa. "Where are you?" I had the temptation to reply, "Adrift at sea." But that would have gone on record. I could have historically been a crucial figure in the annals of diplomacy, because I would have been the first diplomat who was fired before he or she reached their first posting. Now, if you look at today, it's an illustration that, again, a major development in diplomacy is underway at the moment. And I think it's largely a fact that although the United States retains its vitality, it retains its resilience, it retains its position as a leader, but the country is exhausted. 2 wars, 10 years, with despite the valor of the men and women, both diplomats, military officers, soldiers who were there, 6,600 deaths, $1.2 trillion. We've got 2 countries who are not necessarily achieving what was attempted. So now the balance is shifting. Let's try diplomacy. Diplomacy is about influence. The military initiative is about power. You need the military power to have a breakthrough to practice diplomacy. A military initiative sounds bold, it sounds dynamic, and it looks as if there's a quick solution. Diplomacy looks old establishment. It looks deliberate. It takes a long time, and whether or not you have a suitable conclusion. The countries of the West, really, to a lesser extent Europe, are looking at the Pacific pivot, as it's called out of Ottawa. But if this last week shows anything, the United States is not going to be able to undertake that pivot to the extent they'd like to. You read now in the papers about the tragedy of Syria, and you look at the lighthouse, you look at the indications in Washington. What is the administration going to do? What are the opportunities? What are the variables? Only 3. Supply weapons to the rebels, establish a no-fly zone, or one way or the other discourage or capture the chemicals intended for warfare. What you do in Syria has an influence in Lebanon. What you do in Lebanon has an influence in Iran. What's decided in Moscow influences what happens, the decisions in Washington. So you have a situation where every country is linked. And as 2 countries, particularly Canada and the United States, who enjoy the benefits, which were hard-earned, of a democratic system, the elections aren't fraudulent, and people, particularly the young people, within their life can feel, maintain, and achieve a sense of dignity, a sense of justice. Whereas you look at Egypt, a proud country, really the pinnacle of the Arab countries in the region, struggling one way or the other to establish itself after a lack of liberty, a lack of justice, a lack of dignity. Iran, an election this June. Will it give hope that Iran can maybe achieve some sort of level of democracy, which particularly its youth are looking for? Iran, of course, as we talked about, I was mentioned during the introduction, was somewhere where I served for 3 years. It's a paradox. It's a civilization of 3,500 years. Its people have a character, they have a pride, they're seeking a prestige, and yet at the same time, their leadership doesn't seem to do anything but let them down. On a lighter note, as you reflect on changing paths of diplomacy, we talked about the movie a bit. It was a thriller. Certainly, my wife and I saw it in Hollywood, and the tension was building up. Ben Affleck's a marvelous director. He could have you on the edge of your seat. Halfway through the movie, Pat turns to me and said, "Did we get out okay?" I said, "Don't worry, Pat. The ending's going to be good. It's Hollywood." But the movie itself, as a number of those of you I've spoken to during the day, has served a purpose despite the poetic license that is characteristic of Hollywood, that it tended to remind citizens in the United States and Canada, in Western Europe, in Australia, that that's the nature of diplomacy today. It's the nature of having a military presence today. It's a dangerous neighborhood. And particularly the tragic weekend in Benghazi with the 4 U.S. diplomats lost their life, assassinated, I think re-registered in the public mind. My own sense, as I conclude, is that I'm immensely proud of all of you. You sit there, you've worked, some of you did 2 degrees, some of you did it while you were working, and you've got a good reason to feel a great deal of pride. The fact that, again, both countries are represented is reflected again what would have happened in Tehran if the roles would have been reversed. That is, if the Canadians were in difficulty. I feel total assurance that the U.S. Embassy would have done the same thing for us as we did for them. Thank you.